Welcome back. Over the years, communities have had to adapt to stronger, more massive, and increasingly destructive floods. In the Netherlands, some residents have headed up to as high as the floods go, and decided that since they can't beat the waters, they might as well just live on them.
Forget about dikes, sandbags, and spillways. The Dutch have come up with the floating house. In a country where half of the land area is below sea level and more than half the population reside in low-lying areas, these floating houses give the Dutch a chance to cope quite comfortably with floods. So instead of fighting climate change, they're now living with it. This central Dutch village, about 60 miles southeast of Amsterdam, is a community of floating houses or amphibious homes. Several dozen homes, while built on solid ground, are designed to float when waters begin to rise. Made of lightweight wood and a hollow concrete base, each house is fastened to a 15-foot-long mooring post with sliding rings. A starter house with 3 bedrooms will set you back 260,000 euros or about 14.8 million pesos. Following the United States experience with Katrina, Hollywood superstar Brad Pitt unveiled the float house in New Orleans. In case of flooding, the float house can rise up to 12 feet off the ground on 2 guideposts. Morphosis, the firm behind the idea, says the structure is built on a chassis of polystyrene foam and covered with glass-reinforced concrete. Batteries provide power that can last you 3 days. Morphosis says while the flood house has not been tested in actual floods, it has done extensive simulations up to Katrina-like conditions.
Will floating houses work in the Philippines? And is that something that urban planners can already begin to work on, or will it just cost too much? Joining us in the studio are architect Conrad Erfe. He's an associate and head designer at the Jonathan O. Gann and Associates. Also with us, urban planner architect Gelo Aguilar of CAD Aguilar Architecture. Gelo and Jonathan, thank you very much. Jonathan, I'm sorry. Conrad, thank you very much for coming. You know, floating houses, maybe to some people, would seem like a very uncomfortable way to live. But in the Netherlands, apparently they've pioneered the kind of technology that allows them to adapt to their environment. I mean, they usually get floods because they're just so many meters below sea level. And the houses that we've seen can float with the rising water level. Now, in the Philippines, if we were to adapt that, would that be something that might just be feasible, or would it just cost too much?
It will be feasible, but I think studies have to be made on where we should locate these houses. Yeah. Because one thing to consider is the topography, and another would be the soil condition, of course. Because the design they did for the Netherlands is that there's, I think, 2 piles, so that when it floats, the houses don't float away. Don't float away. Yeah. Yes. But of course, the structural integrity of that pile should be also considered, because if it is anchored in soft soil and then flood goes in,
it will just get washed away.
Yes. So I think planning at the onset must be taken into consideration, that maybe areas which are already flood prone should be avoided. But in case that...
that doesn't sound like what what people expect, because if you wanted to build floating houses, you'd put them in areas where you'd necessarily expect floods, right? so that you can benefit from the idea of having a floating house.
Yes, but of course, if it will entail additional costs for owners. And then my ideas on that is, if you're a homeowner and you want to develop a house on an area, it would be best if you can avoid
building on a flood-prone area.
But in case that you cannot avoid, and let's say you want to have this floating house, it can be feasible. But I think studies have to be made, because the design should adapt to the Philippines.
Sure.
In the Netherlands, they designed it that adapts to their climate and their needs also.
Right.
But to us, it should be in a different maybe aspect.
So what do you think, Gelo? Because if, for example, you were in Laguna and you don't necessarily want to leave the place, it didn't used to have that kind of flooding before Ondoy came, but now that you're living there and you're expecting worse floods to come, could you build houses for people who'd be interested that could copy the design of what they had in the Netherlands?
Well, it's too expensive.
Too expensive.
In my point of view. Yeah. Because floating houses, well, they look at this as barges on top of houses on top of barges. However, it's very expensive because there will be problems with regards to compatibility with the land that you own and the barge that you are building.
And what do you mean by compatibility?
Well, barges, you need to have very big tracts of land to fit that barge. And so when there's floods, you should let it sway a bit, so there won't be any problems with regards to rigidity.
Yeah, but you know, what Conrad was saying, that they did institute a design where you had pilings on both sides of the floating house, so that they wouldn't have to necessarily move sideways. So this is like a guidepost.
Yes.
When it goes up, it just stays within.
It's like an anchor.
The restrictions, of, the restrictions of those two pilings. So, I mean, why would that be a problem for them to be moving?
Well, of course, we have to respect the boundaries of your property.
Your neighbors.
Yes, your neighbors. Kung magkakatabi kayo, maliliit yung lupa nyo, pag nagbanggaan kayo, that will be too uncomfortable for residents. Well, if they are going to use hydraulic jacks, that will just follow the level of the flood, that will be better, but that is too expensive.
What I think they did in the Netherlands was they built the foundation using, I think, some kind of compressed foam. That would make it buoyant, no? So they don't need to use hydraulic jacks. I mean, they just necessarily have to allow the loss of hydraulics to float the house up, right?
Yes. The issue there is rigidity when it comes to seismic activities. We are very, very prone to earthquakes. So will the house stand on, let's say, magnitude 6, which is very normal right now, on that level? Kung ano lang yun, bags lang yun.
Yeah. But
that will be the question.
But they necessarily don't design the houses to be too tall or too high, so that if you had an earthquake, you'd minimize maybe the risk of having a spectacular collapse of the entire structure, right? I mean, you can build it more like a bungalow style and not worry about too much the damage that the earthquake could do.
Yeah, but since it is not anchored on the traditional manner, it will still sway. That's what bothers people right now.